So stories of pastors. Since this is a little bit before, then also as well. One of the ways that I minister to pastors is by just meeting with them, caring for them in multiple different ways. And here's a pretty consistent stories across the board is that they're sharing how sometimes that they are asking for help from their church boards and it becomes empty-handed. They're not nobody's responding to them. A pastor shared with me not too long ago that he was going through some significant personal things. No, nothing disqualifying, just personal, and just reached out to his board through an email and no response. And he looks at me and he says, "Should I have done that?" And I said, "Well, absolutely, you should have done that. The elders or the church board should have responded back and said, 'Hey, what can we do? How can we care for you?'" And I just met a pastor. He got fired from his role not too long ago. But he said that several years ago, his dad was let go because the denomination had shifted and changed. And so he was let go. And so then after that, there was just a ripple effect for the family. The pastor's children no longer go to church. They've denied the faith, walked away from things. To another pastor who sometimes they just go through exhaustion. And I went through this one myself, is that you're doing a funeral, and you that's part of the honors and to officiate a funeral, and it's part of those special privileges that pastors do. But when funerals back up one after the other, after the other, after the other, pastors are still expected to carry on the rest of the ministry, still expected to preach on a Sunday morning. And sometimes when you're doing a funeral, you're burying your friends, you're burying family, you're burying different people. And oftentimes the person that gets neglected the most is actually the pastor. And so they go through different exhaustions and tired, and yet the ministry continues to go on. And so tonight, I'm very well aware of this. I'm going to talk about the kind of the behind the scenes, the hard side of being a pastor, the weariness of being a pastor. But I definitely want you to know is that there's some amazing things about being a pastor. There's nothing that can fully describe what it means to be a pastor when you're standing there in the pulpit and be able to preach God's word, or you're there and you're baptizing somebody, or you're there officiating a wedding, or you're multiple different things. There is such pure joy of being a pastor, and when you're called to that, there is no other vocation in this world that is quite like that. Well, we often only talk about that, but we don't talk about the weariness behind the scenes. And so that's what I want to talk about with you. And so if you think about it, and this is this in a given month or given 2 months, a pastor's role has all these things included. And so, what's you see endurance, gospel impact. They're thinking about these unity amongst the church. They want a thriving church. They need to have fruitfulness, longevity. They're inviting people, hospitality. They're doing the funerals. They're thinking about the budget. They're also thinking about, man, I'm gonna have to admonish this person. They're always working on a sermon. There's discipline, right? And they need to they want to help, but there's always divisions behind the scenes, right? They always need to be thinking about the vision and moving things forward and being consistent across the board. And so there's multiple different things that are happening for a pastor at all times. Now, I think about this is that a pastor on a weekly basis, when he's preaching, he will stand in the pulpit, look out across his congregation, and as he's learning different things about people, and he's holding these things confidential, is that he'll look and see that this sermon is supposed to meet the couple that is ready for a divorce. Uh, the person over here, the widow who just lost their husband and they're lonely and they're discouraged and they need a visit, or to somebody from this side of the church will not talk to this person over here because there's a division between the two of them. To a disgruntled deacon, to a disgruntled church board member, to a disgruntled elder. There's multiple different things, and honestly, those are healthy churches. That's a pretty common thing, but the pastor is the one carrying these things and the one thinking about how do I minister towards these people. And so over the course of time, it becomes weary and becomes tiring. And the reality of ministry is we don't always talk about this, but as you look through the New Testament, the reality of ministry, it's not always easy, is it? Especially for the pastor. especially for those who are in church leadership, especially for the church staff. And the reality of ministry is this, is that this is the Apostle Paul talking about this, is that but we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. So he's talking about right now his ministry experiences. We are afflicted in every way, but because of Christ, they're not crushed, perplexed, but not driven to despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed. So those are all like things that a pastor goes through. So the question is, what happens when a pastor faces being afflicted, perplexed, persecuted, struck down? And then what happens when he's feeling just alone and he's not quite where to turn to? There's nobody that is around him. Like I said, that there was a pastor who reached out to his elders and said, "I'm not doing so well," and there was no response from them. Or to the times that I've heard of different stories when somebody in the church just comes in and just uh, comes and attacks them verbally or pulls their wife aside and complains to them and then they call them on a Saturday night. I was talking to a pastor who said, every time I get called, they love that when I'm available, but they don't understand when I'm available, it's also pulling the time away from my family. And so those are some of the things that pastors we think about, but and we know, but it just adds up. And these trends that are coming out, Barna Research does these trends every 7 years, and just here's some stats for you to pay attention to. It is pastors' risk of burnout, and you see in the bottom corner it says from 2015 all the way up to 2022, and then this is when the report came out in 2022. Is that it has increased dramatically from 2015 of high risk of pastors burning out at only 11% to in 2022, 69%. And 25% are at medium risk. And so because of just the complexities of things, how things have shifted and changed, you think about your personal world and what you've going through, the pastor goes through these even sometimes so much more. And so pastor risk of burnout. And so the next one slide is this overall, how satisfied we say you feel with your vocation as a pastor. Notice the age difference between these. Is that pastors under the age of 45, 52% are saying they are somewhat satisfied, to 35% saying not too satisfied here, right? And so, or it's, oh, sorry, I read that wrong, but there are 52% are saying they're somewhat satisfied. And then if the older you get, the more satisfied you actually are, which tells us, as the research is saying, is that the younger generation, they're entering ministry and they're in ministry and they deal with ministry differently than the older generation. And the younger generation, listen, we all know that we're living in a more anxious generation because of social media, the different things. And since I started in ministry, how much things have just shifted and how much they have changed over the years. And so, as the pastors are growing up in anxious generations with all the social media and everything, it's impacting not just the society, the people around them, it's impacting the pastor as well. And so what's happening, and we're seeing this, is that the pastors who are older, they kind of grew up with this, I will be loyal and I'll stick through this and I'll get through this no matter what. The younger generation is saying, no, this isn't worth it anymore. And so what's happening is that 50% of pastors are quitting in the first 5 years, and then 80% of pastors are quitting, saying this isn't worth it anymore because it's having a negative impact upon my family, upon myself. And there 80% is quitting in the first 10 years. And you just think about that, right? Is that the ripple effect of a pastor leaving a church every couple of years, what that does to the pastor himself, what that does if he's married and has kids, the ripple effect it has upon the pastor and his wife and the kids. But then also, and probably many of you have been part of these, is that when a pastor leaves, you have to start a new search committee. And we started a new search committee, and that time becomes consuming, and you're looking for the next person to a godly person to go and be part of to help lead your church. And then from there, right, is that whenever a pastor transitions or leaves for good reasons, for bad reasons, the church, the rest of the church goes, "Oh no, can we trust this next person?" I remember talking to a young pastor who was just very frustrated that he was there and he's there for less than a year, and he just said like, why won't these people? They don't trust me, and I had to explain to him is that like he didn't understand the history of the church is that in the last 10 years, the majority of the pastors, about every 2 or 3 years, a pastor was leaving. And so this next guy that came in, they're just looking at him going, how long will you be with us too? Are you going to leave us as well, just like everybody else has left us? Some left for good reasons, some left for bad reasons. But a pastor's there and is called there to help shepherd a flock. And I want and I desire for pastors to be at that local church, the local church that God has called them to, for as long as they are possible to be. I don't want them to feel discouraged. I don't want them to feel alone. I want them to be able to thrive in their ministry context. And so, as pastors are going through all these things, and these are just the stats that are out there, and we're not making them up, is that pastors, majority, are not asking for help. They're not getting help. And so at most, the 13% are saying they're getting a spiritual advisor or a personal mentor. Some are going to professional counseling, therapist, all these different things, right? But an overwhelming part is that 63% of them are not going and asking for help with any of their struggles that they're going through. They're feeling dissatisfied, they're ready, they're at the risk of burning out, but at the same time, they're not asking for help. So if the trend is true, right? If the trend is that most pastors don't reach out for help, then whose role is it to care for the pastor? I've asked that question multiple different times, and I've asked pastors, one from associate pastor to the senior pastor, who's caring for them? And most of the time, there's a vague, well, I think, I'm not sure, or somebody else is doing it. And I don't think that's good enough. I think that we need to understand who's the one that is caring for our pastors. Who are the people that are supposed to be caring for our pastors? And this is what I believe the church, the scriptures call us, right? The church does not merely receive care from their pastor. It participates in caring for the pastor as well. We need to really like be aware of this, is that our pastor is part of our flock. And scriptures is very clear is that when we practice the one anotherings inside of a local church, that pastor is supposed to be receiving that as well. Now, I've talked with pastors, and at times I've experienced this, even my own self, is that the pastors that we are serving people, but then when we stop serving, it's almost as if nothing is coming back towards us. And we don't do that in order to receive. But when you're going through a hard time, you're going through a lonely time, you're a discouraging time, and you're wondering, is somebody going to care for me? And then nobody does. In essence, and this is not intentional, but this is actually what happens, is that that local church actually puts that pastor outside the care of that church. Because the pastor, right? He's just supposed to care for himself. He's supposed to knowing what to do. He's the most spiritual. He knows all things. He's the leader of this group. And so I've even talked with elders of this and said that elders, you need to understand is that it is your God-given role, it's part of your responsibility is to care for him and care for your pastor. And so I want to look at us and help us look at modeling care for our pastor and ministry staff after Christ. And this is what we want to be looking at is what is the example that Christ has given to us. And so I'm going to read the scriptures for us like a good pastor. I'm not going to give a sermon out of this, but I really want you to be understanding is that when we care for our pastor, it is straight out of Scripture, and we're going to look at Christ as to the things that what he did and look for him for our leadership here. And so I'm just going to read the passage for us. And then this is out of Matthew chapter 26. It says, Then Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane. And he said to his disciples, Sit here while I go over there and pray. And taking with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Then he said to them, My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me. And going a little further, he fell on his face and prayed, saying, My Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. And he came to the disciples and found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, So could you not watch with me 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. Again, for the second time, he went away and prayed, My Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done. And again, he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were weary. So leaving them again, he went away and prayed for the third time, saying the same words again. Then he came to the disciples and said to them, Sleep and take your rest later on. See, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us keep going. Let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand. And so I want to focus on verse, like at the very bottom of verse 37. It says, Remain here and watch with me. And so what I believe is, and the other people agree with this, is that when Christ says, Remain here and watch with me, he is saying, Stay here and pray with me. And so from here is that I want to talk about just 6 ways to watch and pray that Christ set the example for, that I believe that we should also be following the same example as well. So if I could give away tonight a box and give you guys a box tonight, there are 6 things that I want to be able to have you put into your box so you could walk away with and go back and read the scriptures here and say, these are exactly what Adam was talking about as to how we should be caring for our pastors, and not just for our pastor. This goes across the churches and for one another as well. But we're going to look at specifically at Christ, and here they are, and we're going to break them down into far more specifics. But protect rhythms of rest and prayer. The second one is honor wise relational closeness. The third one is normalize honest anguish. The fourth is cultivate relational safety. The fifth is practice shared prayerful dependence. And the sixth one is anchor leadership in resurrection hope. And we're going to walk through this for us. And so the first one, right? Jesus practiced rhythms of rest in prayer. And so we see across the 4 Gospels that Jesus models a sustainable, and that's key, sustainable rhythm of leadership, of how he ministered to the people. One that includes intentional withdrawal, prayerful dependence, and an embodied rest. When Jesus started his ministry, and I used to believe, and I started ministry in the opposite way that Jesus did, and it led to my own personal burnout, is that I thought, and as I read scriptures, is that Jesus started hard, worked hard, and then rested. Worked hard and then rested. Worked hard and then rested. And then eventually what I understood as I read the scriptures and somebody opened my eyes is that Jesus started from a place of rest, a spiritual and physical rest. And then he ministered, he worked hard, but always came back to a consistent time of rest where he intentionally withdrew from people. And when he withdrew from people, he was becoming prayerfully dependent upon the Lord. And that helped to just embody rest. And so as you think about that, as Jesus practiced the rhythms of rest and prayer, and this is exactly what he was doing at the Garden of Gethsemane, is that he knew what was coming. And before he knew what was coming, before he could enter into the hardest ministry of his entire life of going to the cross, right? is that he needed to pull away from everybody else and he needed to go in prayerfully dependence of going and talking to the Father. And so the question I have is just if you're a church board member, right, is thinking about this. Do we protect these rhythms for our pastor or unintentionally erode them? Now, oftentimes is that we confuse availability of our pastor, of our ministry staff with faithfulness. And so, listen, there is always something to do in ministry. There is no like time really off unless you're intentional about it. What's your church culture like? Does your pastor ever get a time to practice the rhythms of Jesus Christ? Is that a priority for you? Or is it we're just going to go to the next thing, to the next thing, to the next thing, to the next thing, to the next thing? That's something for you to really like to think about is what type of culture does your church have? Does it protect the day off of the pastor? What's the pastor doing on his day off? Is there even a time allowed in his schedule for him to step back and go for a time of quietness and just praying with the Lord? One of the things that I practiced years ago, I started back probably 8, 10 years ago, was that on Monday mornings, is that I would call them just my walks with Jesus. Because I realized that if I started Monday morning going right into the church office, then I was far more prone to just becoming dependent on what I could do in my skills and what all the things that my gifts and my talents. But when I put it into my schedule and I realized that it was very important for me as a pastor to go on these prayer walks with the Lord just for an hour, sometimes an hour and a half on Monday morning, it helped me to slow down the week and intentionally just go and say, Lord, this is not about Adam this week. It is about you and what you are doing. And so I just put that into my regular work schedule. So a key concept is that a rested pastor is not disengaged. He is rightly dependent. In fact, you can flip it on the other way, right? Is that a pastor that is always available is not rightly dependent. Pastors, we sometimes will fall into this false belief that if you are not there, if you don't do it, the church will fall apart. And that's not being dependent upon the Lord. That's thinking of yourself way too highly. Or for a church board, if our pastor's not there, will it fall apart? Or can we depend upon somebody else? So the second one, that is Jesus practiced relational closeness, not relational isolation. Uh, Jesus was intentional and intentionally drew a few into closer relational proximity. This was not favoritism, it was actually wise shepherding for himself and for the people around him. There was a time when I was in my early 20s in my very first church that I was serving at, and I saw this happening with the senior pastor. And I, being young, I just was jealous of this. And I lovingly, my youngness, I confronted the senior pastor, said, well, why am I not part of that group? And he looked at me and says, Adam, I can draw in whom I want to. And he, for a close friendship. And so, he rightly put a boundary of going because I was just being young and immature on that. And it wasn't about him being having favoritism, but he was understanding that he was going to have needs and he needed spiritually mature people around him. And so the question that we want to be asking as church boards is that who has relational permission to know our pastor beyond the performance? There's just a constant reality is that we have a lot of lonely pastors. And they feel completely isolated. They will preach on a Sunday morning, and they will go and minister to people, and yet they will walk out of the service, walk out of a Sunday morning going, nobody actually asked how I was doing today. And if they're not asking the pastor how he's doing, guess who else they aren't asking as well? They're not asking his spouse. They're not asking the children how they're doing, or if it is, you know, please don't get too real with us, right? And so we want to be able to know, and I think this is part of just like accountability. And maybe as a church board member, you're going, "Hey, it's probably not me," uh, but who? who relationally knows the pastor beyond the performance? And I also believe this is where a lot of pastors they get themselves into trouble, is that they don't have these close friends where they're able to be real, and these friends don't like, and nobody's able to hold them, encourage them back to the gospel, hold them accountable. And so this is where we get pastors who fail, and we go, well, how did we get here? We just didn't know. Well, because a lot of times we love our pastors based on their performances to what they can do in the pulpit. How many people are coming on a Sunday morning? Is the budget? Are we meeting budget? And those become our parameters. If that's going well, then he must be going well also. So the key concept is that pastors do not thrive in isolation. The Lord did not create us that way. They flourish in wisely chosen closeness. And so I think every pastor needs to have somebody, a group of people that they're wisely chosen and that's close to them. It'd be wonderful that if it's people from the church board because they're able to share so many more things. And oftentimes it is that, I would have friends in the church, but so many things I just could not share with them because of the confidential nature of the things that people were sharing with me that weighed me down, that were burdens that I just couldn't share with them. And so those things actually, those can become very isolating for a pastor. So who does he share with? And so that's honestly one of the reasons I started Shepherd and Care is that when a pastor does not have a place that he can share confidentially, I become that place for them. Is that I can become the shepherding care ministry, become that confidential place that they can process situations, they can share their doubts, they can share their upsets, they can share their discouragements, which leads us right into this next one, is that Jesus was honest about his inner anguish. If you go back and you read the passage that from tonight, is that and I'll read it for us, is that in verse 38, oh, it's in verse 37, he says, and taking with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Then he said to them, my soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me. Jesus named his sorrow without panic or shame. He did not spiritualize away his distress, nor did he hide it, especially with the people that were closest to him. Now, this just struck me, and this is why I chose this passage, because I was just constantly looking through the scriptures, going, well, how did the Lord deal with hard times? What was the inner man? What was he like? Does Scripture speak to this? And here's a passage that says it, right? Is that here it says his sorrowful and trouble. Sorry, he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Then he said, "My soul." And soul is his inner world, in that he was anguished to the point of death. Now, if your pastor was this open and honest with you, how would you respond? Would you start questioning his emotional maturity? Would you start questioning, is this pastor depressed? Is this, should we start thinking about the next pastor? What would you do? Well, if you look at the example of Christ and you see the reaction by the disciples, it's almost as if this was not the first time that Jesus had shared this level of emotional pain, this anguish to them, because based on their response after Jesus had shared this with them, they fell asleep on him. It's almost as if there's Jesus again. He's just being open and honest about what's going on inside of him. Man, I'm so tired. Well, we'll deal with this tomorrow. And did Jesus, like, he didn't like panic. He didn't feel shame that this is what he was going through. And honestly, we get another picture of this in Hebrews chapter 5. It says this, in the days of his flesh, and this is speaking actually of this moment, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverence. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. And so you see that when Christ was walking this earth in his flesh, he offered up to his Father prayers and supplications with what? with loud cries and tears. That tells me that this was a pretty common thing that Jesus w was talking, was doing in his life, is that he went through anguish. And when he went through anguish, he would often go and he would consistently go and pray to his Father because and then he was heard because of his reverence, because of who Christ is. And but then you have this example of he didn't just go privately and shared only with God the Father. Here he's sharing with his inner circle, Peter, James, and John, about what was actually going on in his life. And so we want to be thinking about this is that can our pastor speak honestly about fear, the weariness, or the sorrow that he's going through? Can a pastor come and talk to the board of elders or the church board and going, hey, I just have some real doubts right now. I'm not sure what's going on. I don't know how. I'm kind of fearful of leading the church forward. Can he be that honest? Or does he feel actually the pressure to manage our comfort instead of his own soul? I heard a pastor once share the story of he was just going through a very, very hard time. And he pulled an elder that he thought he could share with. And as he started to open up, the elder just literally stopped him and says, no, please don't share with me. I need your life to be together because my life is just falling apart. And which is just sad. And so the pastor just felt in isolation, going, where do I go? What can I do? And honestly, that those things become almost too often and too common for people. So a key concept for number three is that emotional honesty is not emotional instability. It's actually spiritual maturity. Is that when you are able to identify and be able to name some of the things that you're going through, and then come in and ask somebody to go in and to help to help the person to be able to share it's actually a very mature thing because we look at Christ. He himself did it, and he should be our example. But oftentimes we feel if I share anguish with somebody, it's me just being far too emotional. But that's not true. So, number four is that Jesus invited others into his burden through prayer. I think this is such a key concept. And, maybe you're walking away tonight going, wait, all this night is just about prayer? Well, yeah. If the Lord Jesus, in the biggest moment of life, in the biggest moment of the story of Scripture, goes and pulls away and demonstrates that going, I have the hardest thing that anybody has ever done is coming tomorrow. And he took the time and said, my decision now is my leadership decision is to pull away and to go and pray. And then I'm inviting others to do that as well. Should we not make this a major practice and a major essential thing in our churches about how often do we go through church, make our strategic decisions, make vision plans, do all these things, and just almost toss up a prayer to the Lord, say, please bless this. So Jesus did not merely ask for understanding, he invited participation. He said, remain here and watch with me. And so it's very essential for us is that as a pastor and just as an individual as well, right? Is that when you share, we don't want to just be processing things. We want to be able to ask them, please do something. And so he's saying, remain here and pray to the Father with me about the hardship that is going on. And so, board reflection is like, how often do we ask others to pray, not just plan? Is this built into your regular rhythm, into your board meetings? Is this built into your church? Is this built into your even your own daily life? Is like, do we treat prayer as foundational or just supplemental, as something that we know we're supposed to get to? Another question is that rest rhythm. Boards, are you protecting your pastor's time enough in requiring him? And I think it's okay to require him saying, it's so important that we need to give you time to go and pray and be prayerfully dependent. If you are the one that is supposed to open up the Word of God and to preach with us on a Sunday morning, we need to make sure that you are spiritually staying attuned to the Lord. And not just, but we want to also join in with you as well. So a key song concept is that shared prayer, it's not a sign of weakness, but it's just a sign of humble leadership. If Christ did this and he showed us how to be humble, we also need to match that as well. And so asking others to come and to pray with us is pretty essential. I know of a pastor who in a board meeting just opened up and said, "Hey, this is what's going on in my life," and this was the prayer time. But then what happened is that after the elders meeting or after that elders meeting, in weeks to come, nobody followed up with him. And so then he questions whether again, so, we're jointly asking for prayers, but I'm being really vulnerable about a prayer that it took me a lot of courage to share, and we'll pray here, but then there's actually no follow-up afterwards. Well, guess what happens? The next time the pastor won't open up. And if a pastor is not opening up, then that helps us set the culture as well. So we want to be really aware when a pastor opens up or anybody opens up, we need to be following up with that person after meetings. So, uh, number five is that Jesus endured disappointment while remaining submitted to the Father. You see here is that even when his closest companions, Peter, James, and John, right, failed him, Jesus remained anchored in trustful submission to the Father's will. Jesus, and I think this was a great leadership thing that he had done, is that he said, "Please wait and stay here and watch with me, pray with me." And then he gave them opportunities. And what happened is that they came back and he said, What's going? Stay with me. Don't fall into temptation." He came back, and then they failed him because when he came back again, they failed him on three different times. But he gave those guys opportunities. And what he was doing is showing that the assertiveness is saying, no, this is really important to me. Is that I need you to stay and I need you to pray with me. So oftentimes what happens in life, right, we ask one time, and if somebody doesn't follow through, then we go, fine, they don't care. But here we have the Father or the Son coming and asking for the disciples to support him at three different times. But the reality is friends, is that often we fail each other. And even as we fail each other, who never fails us? And this is exactly what Christ did, is that he continued to be submitted to the Father's will. And praise God that he did. If not, we wouldn't even be here today talking about this, right? So, boards, how do we help our pastors endure disappointment without carrying it alone? And where are we encouraging dependence on God rather than endurance in isolation? Are they allowed to be as open and honest about their life as Christ is? We want them to be godly, biblical, Christ-centered pastors, but yet then we don't want them to go through the hardships and be open and honest. Well, those two can't go hand in hand. So, key concept is sustainable ministry is formed where weakness meets the resurrection hope, right? Is that our hope is not in the situation itself. Our hope, and this is what pastors are continually preaching and talking about, is the resurrection hope that only comes through Jesus Christ, because oftentimes we don't know how things are going to turn out. But Christ went to the cross knowing that he would rise again. But he's went through everything, that every temptation that we went through, every struggle that we went through, and that's why we get this example. But the hope that he had was not just in that moment, but of what was yet to come. And so that's where our resurrection hope comes from. It is not from each other. It's not from ourselves. It's truly from God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. It's truly from God. But along the way is that we need to continue to build a safe places for people to be able to share, especially for our pastors. And so the sixth one is a safe or unsafe environment shapes what a pastor shares. And so I want you to be thinking about this, is that the health of a leadership culture is revealed by how it responds to vulnerability. There was one time I was part of a church and we went through a really hard time. And I mentioned to the group, to the elders, I said, "Hey, why don't we just can we take a moment and just can we lament? Can we just like talk about the pain that we just all went through, that we all just experienced?" And the elder now who has said this, we will joke about this, but he looked at me and said, "Adam, are you talking about us just?" Emotionally vomiting right now and talking about all the hardships. And at that point, I realized that was not going to happen. But then about a year, maybe 2 years later, is that we were out for breakfast, and that same elder was then just lamenting about all the things that we had just gone through and the hardships that we'd gone through and the struggles. And I jokingly would gently point out, it's like, are you emotionally vomiting right now on about things? And he understood is that there are times in ministry, especially as a group of elders or a church board or as a church, when you go through such significant hardships, is that you need to take these moments in time and to be able to lament about what was going on and not just push it on and push it to the side and continue as business as normal, because that is just not biblical leadership. That's not what Christ did, and that's not what the leadership of the church should do. And so relational immaturity responses, they're often unspoken, right? And so somebody reaches out and asks for help, a pastor asks for help, but it's met with silence or this emotional just withdrawal. Let's just stick to the facts. Let's just talk like high theology. Let's not talk about just personal things that you're going through. And as I said before, it's like there was sometimes we don't want our pastors to go through hard times. It's that please don't share that. My life is already overwhelming. Well, who does the pastor go to if he can't come to his leadership and talk with them? And so, bold reflection is that what response has our culture trained our pastor to expect? And there's also this responsibility for the pastor, right? Is that he helps, that they help to shape the culture of the church board of the church as well. So it's not just all one way. Please don't hear me saying that. But as church boards, are we helping to set the culture for our pastors? Is safety just assumed or is it intentionally cultivated? I will say if it's just assumed, it's probably not there. As people, we don't it's really hard for us to set the tone to be to be really that safe place and stuff, right? What does it mean for somebody to share a deep thing? Does it get shared with spouses at home? Do we talk about it on the side or going, can you believe what they just said? Those are things that we have to intentionally cultivate in our churches. And so key concept, right? Is the pastor will only be as honest as the environment is safe, and we just need to be really aware of that. And that's a rule for across the board. If the church board is not a safe place for the pastor to share, but yet you want him to come to be vulnerable and authentic in the pulpit, it needs to be both and. He needs to be able to be open and honest in the pulpit about how things are going, but then really the ones that are closest, the inner circle, the church board needs to be that safe place for the pastor just to be able to talk about some of the struggles or things that he's going through. Because if not, then he's going to share in a pulpit the weight of that and then carry the weight by himself as well. So, next one. And this is just question and answer. If you want to, this is my question for you, is that you can type it in, right? In what ways do church boards and people in the church fall asleep on our pastor and ministry staff? If you got ways and stuff, go ahead and talk about it and stuff, and I'll answer those for everybody and stuff. If not, we'll talk about that in a little bit again as well. So, but I really want to get really practical with us, and those things were practical. But I want to continue just to walk down through as to how practical we can get. And so, what does falling asleep look like? falling asleep, it looks like is that we prioritize the busyness over souls. And so we see a pastor only as someone who supplies a service for the growth of the church. I can't tell you how many times that somebody just talks about the job description of a pastor and saying he's supposed to fulfill all these things. And if I could have my way, I would change the word job description to a ministry description. And because when a pastor comes, and it's more than just him fulfilling a service for the church, and because if it's just a service for the church, it becomes very transactional. They will start looking for the next person to fulfill the things that they need to, in order to grow the church. Uh, But a church is not a business, right? A church is a place for souls to come, and it's more of an organism that is living and is breathing. And you don't just replace somebody to get to the next person, get to the next best person, get to the next best person. And so we need to prioritize the soul of the pastor. And so, assuming he's fine because sermons, ministries, and the budgets are strong. I can honestly tell you that I know of specific stories that the elders thought things were fine because of these three criterias. The sermons, people were coming, the budget appeared to be really strong, the ministries were strong, but what they discovered was that there was this moral failure behind the scenes that he just was covering up. And so they had fallen asleep because they stopped caring for him, stopped paying attention to all the warnings, all the things that are around him. They didn't realize that he didn't actually have any close friends that are with him. And so one of the areas is that just ignoring warning signs of burnout or compassion fatigue. Uh, does your pastor understand what those things are? The compassion fatigue. Do they understand what burnout looks like? Do you understand what burnout and compassion fatigue is? And if I could plug a webinar that's coming up, I'm going to be talking about these two things for burnout and compassion fatigue. It's a consistent thing that pastors are going to be struggling with and facing on a regular basis. And so we need to, as church boards, be protecting around them is facing to help them to face this. And so we don't want to avoid the awkward conversations that provide clarity. I know it's hard. I know it's difficult to have awkward conversations, but having clarity, it's actually kindness. And to be able to talk about things that are happening, or your expectations of the pastor or different things like that, or you hear something that doesn't just seem quite right. Or you just see the pastor, he just sermons are just starting to lack. A pastor shared with me one time, an elder came to him. This was 20 years ago. He said, a pastor came to him, an elder came and said, "What's going on with your sermons? They're really lacking now." And he just looked at him and said, I am in so many meetings and so many counseling situations and all these different things that I'm tired and I don't have time to give towards my sermon. And so so it's like, well, the awkward conversation was going, "Hey, what's happening with your sermons?" And then you understand is like, oh, your time has been eaten up with all these other things. Well, and from there, they went and hired another pastor to help them out to be able to do those things and stuff. So, uh, ignoring the spouse and children of the pastor. This is a pretty huge. It's pretty significant. I always put a rule of thumb is that you loved me, my elders and the church boards would love me as well as they would love my wife and kids. And if they didn't care for my wife and kids, that means that they weren't going to come and love and care for me. I know of pastors who they've been at the church for a long time, and the church board barely knows the kids' names, the pastor's kids' names. Or the course of time, nobody has paid attention to the wife, and nobody talks to the wife at all. And so what it ends up being, that's a very transactional church, is what that situation ends up being. And it's a very sad and can end up being a very lonely place for the pastor to go and to be, because he's the one that is talking to the elders, wives, the church boards, and knowing the kids and knowing all these things, but in reciprocation, is what that church board has done actually is has moved that pastor outside the circle of care, outside of receiving the much needed one anotherings, the life nourishment that is part of the local church. And so what it looks like is cultivating a watch and prayer environment. There's three slides to this, is that listen, if a pastor comes and talks to you, listen, don't fix it immediately. A listening ear can be truly a spiritual act of protection. And right, and so the next one is ask reflective questions. Well, what is the hardest part about this season? How can we pray with you? How can we be on watch with you? Please encourage, avoid the premature judgment. Christ's disciples didn't call the meeting to assess his fitness, did they? Right? They stayed near, even as imperfectly as they did. They didn't run away. They didn't avoid him. They physically fell asleep, and that's why Jesus said, "Your spirit, it is willing, but your flesh is weak." And that's when it is pray with him, not just for him. Join him in seeking the Father's will together. And this is, I think, a really of just of significance that we really want to be thinking about is that um, when we are going through ministry, we are serving with each other, pray with each other. Spend time not just in that moment, but get together and pray and talk about the hardships. One of the best things that I could ever have done as a pastor was somebody shares with me, and as they shared with me the hardships and struggles that they're going through, and oftentimes I didn't know what to do, but I always know who to go to. And it was those in my office or those in the moment we'd go and just then spend the time and go and pray to God the Father, please, would you do something because we don't know what to do. And so that's cultivating a watch and prayer environment. And then it's that building rhythms of soul care. Schedule regular prayer time and reflection in your board meetings. Don't neglect it. This is there's a whole concept about building time wedges for your pastor. And if you're not familiar with time wedges, I would love to talk with you afterwards. Just building time in between meetings and events and stuff that are very intentional so they can actually breathe and go through things. So, what is your pastor's high energy reward? And this is another just very practical thing that you can go through. What gives them energy and is a high reward for them versus the other side is going, it takes so much time and it takes so much energy out of them is that you need like to understand where those quadrants are and being a good steward of the time. And so the next one is that encourage rhythms of spiritual retreats, a sabbatical, rhythms of rest, soul care renewal days, silent retreats. Name something but build this into it. Christ did it himself. Is that he got away and he spent time with just the Father, and this was a constant thing that he's doing. And so encourage financially support counseling, in mentoring and coaching without the stigma of that, hey, you need some coaching. Well, what's wrong with you? Can you not handle this yourself? That's just, I think we need to start moving away from that, especially for our younger generation of pastors. They're needing it far more than many others. And the next one, the last one, is create opportunities for honest conversation. I think this is a great one. How can we best walk with you right now? And commit to confidentially and prayerfully listening. Then adopt and watch and prayer practice. I love it when the church boards I was part of that we did this is we dedicated rhythm at every board meeting to a time of prayer for dependence. I love this question is that what is and has God been doing in our midst? And sharing the personal testimonies about what's happening in their own life, but talking about are there new believers that are coming in our church? Is there any sin that's been confessed recently that we can all we know about? What about the baptisms or the strife that was happening? Let's celebrate that reconciliation was happening as well. Um, and so I got a comment here that says maybe we can also share the burden of ministry together at a deeper level. Absolutely, yes. And that's I think really essential. And so is that attendance, and this is sometimes what we focus on is like, well, not enough people came to Sunday school, or not enough people are in our life group ministry, and we look at that as the only indicators that God is doing something. And I'll say large churches, just because people are gathering large in large spaces, doesn't mean that God is doing something. It just means that people are coming, right? And so we want to look at other things as to what God is doing as our metrics is to that God is doing something. And so pray over your staff, the people in your church by name. It takes a lot of work, but that's just part of what it is that we need to be doing is shepherding our flocks. And so then there's also, no, friends, there are wolves within your flock. At the end of the passage, this passage is that Jesus said, get up now, for our betrayer is at hand. And he was talking about Judas at the time. Is we just got to be so fully aware is that we have to be prayerfully dependent upon the Lord for doing the things that like for growing our church, and also be aware that there are wolves that are right there in our flock. And so we want to just be very aware of that. And so somebody wrote a question over here, so I'm going to slide over here. I'll read over. I think a great help would be to encourage the congregation to reflect back, share with the pastor how a message or his ministry in general is impacting the Christian walk. Amen. Relationship with God. It's so encouraging to know you're making a difference. 100%. When I go in and I visit and I do pulpit supply, I always say, please let your pastor know how you may have how he has impacted you, of not just about that moment, but how that moment has helped you to grow in your relationship with Jesus Christ. And just, it's so encouraging. And so, a question and answer, anything else, or a question and answer, and then we're getting to the very end of our time here. I'm seeing nothing coming through. That's okay. Thanks for the comments that are coming already, but.